The mourning Patience Vane refused to sign her name to Sir Edmund Crail's betrothal document. The drawing room at Ashford Hall held 12 people and made no sound at all. She had set the quill down on the writing table without drama, without a speech, without a tremble in her hand. The document lay there, its 4 dense paragraphs of legal Latin and the blank at the bottom, where her signature should have gone, and Patience simply stepped back from the table and folded her hands at her waist. Lady Vane, seated in the chair nearest the fire, had gone the precise shade of white that meant the worst was coming. Sir Edmund, standing at the window with his hat in his hands, had turned to look at Patience with the particular contempt of a man who has never been refused anything by a woman of lesser means. The 12 people in the room had all seen it. Not one of them spoke, and then a footman near the door cleared his throat and said, in the reflexive, unhesitating voice of a servant who has just recognized a face he was not expecting to see, "My lord, shall I fetch the carriage?" He had addressed this question to the man standing quietly near the far wall. The man who had been presented to the room, not an hour earlier, as Mr. Patrick Fletcher, land surveyor. The room tilted on its axis. Pull the morning back, then. Go back to the cold October that started all of it. Shropshire had turned by the first week of that month, the hedgerows going russet and the fields past harvest, the lanes narrowed by mud that would not dry until spring. The Vane household occupied a comfortable but not grand stone house on the edge of the Ashford estate's outer grounds, where Lady Vane had lived since Patience's father died 11 years prior, in a condition of moderate gentility that required constant management to maintain. The household ran on 3 servants and Patience's daily attention to the account books. She balanced the coal merchant's quarterly invoice against what remained of the autumn's pin money. She wrote her mother's correspondence in a hand her mother claimed was more legible than her own. She ordered the kitchen garden, arranged the flowers for the hall, and made certain the quarterly rent to the estate trustees was correct before it left the house. She was 23 years old and had done this work since she was 17, and nobody in the household, including Lady Vane, had ever thought to remark upon it. Lady Vane thought about other things. She thought about Patience's marriageability, which she assessed the way a cautious buyer assesses a horse at market, noting the strong points with a kind of grudging approval and returning always to the deficiencies. No dowry to speak of, a modest family name. Adequate face and figure, though nothing of the striking sort that might compensate for the deficiencies. She had written to her cousin in London the previous January with an inquiry, and the reply, which Patience had not been meant to see, but which had been left open on the writing desk in the library, had contained the phrase, "A girl of 24, with no portion will find the field quite thin." Patience had read exactly 7 words of it before she understood what she was reading and set it face down. That had been January. By October, Lady Vane had found Sir Edmund Crail. He came up from Hereford with an introduction from the same London cousin, a baronet of 51 with a complicated relationship to his own finances and a £400 settlement figure that Lady Vane considered reasonable given the circumstances. Sir Edmund had twice thinning hair, a voice that seemed permanently set to correct someone, and an opinion of Patience that he rendered to Lady Vane in the morning room, while Patience was in the next room setting out the tea things, and could hear every syllable through the connecting door. "She has sense enough," he had said. "One doesn't require more than sense in a country wife." Lady Vane had agreed, and the sound of her agreement was the sound of a woman closing a chapter she had wanted to close for some time. Patience had carried the tea tray in without any change in her expression, and poured without spilling a drop. It was the following week, in the 3rd week of October, that the surveyor appeared on the Ashford grounds. She had been walking the east path with a basket of mending to return to Mrs. Dallow the housekeeper who lived in the old caretaker's cottage at the edge of the estate, and who had mended and returned Patience's household linens since Patience was a child. The path went along the stone wall of the walled garden, and then through a stand of beeches before it opened onto the track that led to the gatehouse. And it was in the stand of beeches that she encountered the man. He was standing quite still, looking at something in the distance with a surveyor's rod propped against a tree nearby and a worn leather notebook open in his hand. He was not particularly tall, but he was built with a kind of settled solidity that suggested he was not accustomed to being moved by weather or inconvenience. His coat was dark and practical, not a working man's coat exactly, though something about the way it sat across his shoulders suggested it was not entirely his own sort of coat either. His boots were clean despite the muddy path. Patience noticed the boots because clean boots on a muddy October path in Shropshire required a specific kind of effort. Then she noticed his hands, which were not a labouring man's hands. "The track to the gatehouse," she said, because he was looking at the tree line and not at the path. "Turns left at the elder tree, not right. The right fork takes you back to the home farm." He turned. His face was composed, the face of a man who absorbed information rather than reacting to it, and he looked at her directly, which was not what a workman usually did when addressed by a lady on estate grounds. "I am obliged to you, miss," he said. "The elder is distinctive enough in October," Patience said, "but it loses its character by November. You may want to note the stone marker at the base as the more reliable landmark." He wrote something in his notebook. "A useful correction," he said. "Thank you." She walked on. She mentioned him to Mrs. Dallow in passing, the way one mentions anything observed on a familiar route. Mrs. Dallow received the information with the particular stillness of a woman who already knew something she had decided not to share, and asked whether Patience would take a cup of tea before the walk back. Patience stayed for half an hour, sitting in the low-ceilinged cottage kitchen with a cup of tea that was strong and properly hot, while Mrs. Dallow's grey tabby cat walked across the table with the confidence of a creature that owned the premises. She had known Mrs. Dallow since childhood and felt, in that kitchen, the particular ease of a room where no assessment was being made. On the walk back she met him again. This time it was raining. One of those thin, determined October rains that are not heavy enough to excuse sheltering but cold enough to be disagreeable. And she was crossing the open ground between the beeches and the stone wall when she saw him standing near the garden gate with his notebook under his arm and no hat. She had her shawl and also the spare one she had tucked into the basket on her way out, in the habit of a woman who lives in Shropshire in October and plans accordingly. She did not deliberate about it. She simply took the spare shawl from the basket and held it out. "This will do for the walk," she said. "You can leave it with Mrs. Dallow when you've done with it. She keeps the gatehouse keys and she'll see it returned." He looked at the shawl, then at her, with an expression she could not entirely read. "That is very good of you," he said, and his voice had a quality she had noticed in the beeches, a precision that sat oddly against the surveyor's coat. "It is only practical," she said, and went on through the garden gate before the rain worsened. She did not think much about it after. There were the household accounts to finish, and a reply to draft for Lady Vane's correspondence with Crayle's solicitor, and thinking about a surveyor on the estate grounds seemed a small expenditure of attention against those demands. Lady Vane did not share this economy of attention. In the last week of October, over breakfast, she set down her coffee cup and told Patience that the settlement terms had been agreed in principle, and that Patience would receive Sir Edmund at Ashford Hall on the 14th of November, along with Lady Vane's cousin from London and Sir Edmund's solicitor, and that the betrothal document would be ready for signature. Patience held her toast and said nothing. "You have not objected," Lady Vane said, which she appeared to mean as a compliment. "I have not yet formed my full view of the matter," Patience said. Lady Vane's expression sharpened. "At 23, with your circumstances, you have formed quite enough view already. Sir Edmund is settled, respectable, and prepared to accept you without further negotiation. That is a great deal, Patience, a great deal more than the alternative." Patience set her toast down. "What is the alternative you are imagining, Mamma?" Lady Vane looked at her with the specific disappointment of a woman who had been asked to say aloud what she had hoped to leave implicit. "The alternative is precisely what your circumstances produce," she said. "An increasing narrowness of option. I am acting in your interest." Patience thought of the opened letter on the library desk, the one she had set face down in January, and said nothing further. It was a week after that when she heard her mother in the library. She had not been listening. She had come down the back stair for the household keys, which were kept on a hook near the library door, and her mother was inside speaking with Lady Vane's cousin, Mrs. Aldridge, who had arrived 2 days early and taken the guest room at the end of the hall. The door was not fully closed. Patience reached for the keys on the hook and stilled her hand when she heard her own name. "The girl has no understanding of what she costs," her mother was saying. "I have managed this house on a widowed income for 11 years, and she manages the accounts as though the accounts are a substitute for a useful life. She will refuse Crail if she thinks she can. That is her nature, to refuse what is offered and wait for something that is not coming." "Mrs. Aldridge said something low that Patience could not hear. "The £400 is not generosity," Lady Vane continued. "It is the correct price for a girl of her age and situation. Crail understands he is not buying brilliance. He is buying a competent woman who will not complain. That is a fair exchange, and she is lucky it is on the table at all." Patience took the keys from the hook. Her hand was steady. She went upstairs and sat at the small writing table in her room and looked at the grey October garden through the window for some time without writing anything. She had known, in the abstract, that this was how her mother thought. A woman does not read 7 words of a letter and set it face down without understanding what the remaining words contain. But hearing it spoken in her mother's own voice, in the library she had dusted and catalogued and kept in order for 6 years, was a different kind of knowing. The abstract had become specific. The price had been named. £400. A competent woman who will not complain. She was very still for a long time. Then she took out her pen and opened the household ledger and finished the month's accounts, because the accounts were not finished, and they needed to be finished. 2 days later, on a morning when the frost had come properly and the Ashford garden paths had gone hard underfoot, she walked to Mrs. Dallow's cottage to collect a repaired pillowcase and found the surveyor there. He was sitting at Mrs. Dallow's kitchen table with a cup of tea, and the grey tabby was on the chair beside him, as though the cat had known him for years. He stood when she came in, which was more ceremony than a hired surveyor owed to anyone. "Miss Vane," Mrs. Dallow said with the tone of a woman introducing 2 people who have already met, "Mr. Fletcher is finishing his survey of the east boundary." "I remember Mr. Fletcher," Patience said, and sat down, because Mrs. Dallow was already pouring and the walk had been cold. She did not expect to stay long, but she stayed an hour because the conversation was the kind that does not hurry itself. He asked about the estate's eastern drainage, which she knew from the account books, and she told him what she knew without simplifying it. And he listened in the way that people who are used to being told less than they want to know listen when they are finally told enough. He asked about the old estate library, whether the maps in it were current, and she said she could not speak to currency, but they were extensive and organised by survey date. "I should be glad to look at them," he said, "if it would not be an imposition." "The library is Mrs. Dallow's to arrange," Patience said, looking at the housekeeper. Mrs. Dallow looked at neither of them in particular and said she could manage that. The library was a long, cold room on the ground floor of Ashford Hall proper, accessible through a side door that Mrs. Dallow kept unlocked during the survey week. It smelled of old paper and the particular quality of cold that collects in rooms with high ceilings and not enough fire. The maps were rolled and labelled in wooden cases along the north wall, organised by decade, the earliest ones from 1743 and the most recent from 1819. Patience knew this because she had reorganised them herself 3 years prior, when the estate trustees had written to ask whether the records were in order. She did not intend to be in the library at the same time as Fletcher. She had come to return a borrowed volume to its proper shelf, a habit she maintained whether or not anyone was about, and he was already there with 2 map cases open on the long reading table, and his notebook filled with small, precise writing. She shelved the book and did not leave. It was not a decision, exactly. There was a volume of estate history from 1807 she had been meaning to examine more closely, and it was on the shelf nearest the table, and the fire had been lit against the cold, so the room was almost comfortable. They spent 2 hours in the library and spoke very little, and the silence between them had none of the quality that uncomfortable silences possess. He spread the 1801 survey on the table, and she came to look at it, because the east boundary in 1801 had been redrawn, and she knew from the account books where the original markers had stood, and she showed him with her finger where the discrepancy lay. He looked at her hand on the map, then at the notation in his book, and made a small correction in pencil. "You know this estate well," he said. "I have lived on its edge for 11 years, she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the map. "That is a particular kind of knowledge," he said, "not the same as owning it." She looked at him. He was looking at the map, and his expression gave nothing away. "No," she agreed, "not the same." The walled garden was quieter than the library and colder, but on the first morning of November, when the low sun came horizontal over the stone walls and turned the last of the espaliered branches to copper, it was the most beautiful place on the estate grounds. Patience came through the garden gate with her basket and found him there. Notebook closed for once, standing in the copper light and looking at the old espalier like a man taking account of something. He heard her step on the gravel and turned. "I had not expected company," he said, which was not an objection. "Nor I," she said, and went to the far end of the garden where the herb beds were, and began doing what she had come to do. She was aware of him the way one is aware of a fire in a cold room, not dramatically, but as a constant fact of the temperature. He moved along the espalier wall with his hands behind his back, and she clipped the last of the rosemary for drying, and the garden was very quiet. "Do you stay much longer in Shropshire?" she asked, because the question was natural and not because she was afraid of the answer. "Some weeks yet," he said. "The survey has complications I had not anticipated." She nodded and did not ask what complications, because she understood that there are complications a person does not wish to name before they have resolved them. "Miss Vane," he said from the other end of the garden after a pause long enough that she had almost returned to her work entirely. She turned. He was looking at her in a direct way that was not impolite, and also not quite the look of a man who considered himself merely a visitor on Ashford grounds. "I find I value your opinion," he said, "on a matter I am not yet at liberty to put plainly. I would ask only that you continue to believe that people in this county may sometimes be other than they appear." Patience considered this for a moment. "I have always believed that," she said. He gave a small nod. "I thought so," he said, and looked back at the espalier wall. She walked home in the thin November light, with her basket of rosemary, and did not know what to do with the sentence he had spoken. So she did nothing with it except carry it carefully. She was accustomed to carrying things carefully. On the 12th of November, 2 days before the assembly at Ashford Hall, Lady Vane sent for Patience to the morning room and placed the betrothal document on the table between them. "Read it," she said. Patience read it. 4 paragraphs of settled legal arrangement. Her name was in the second paragraph. The £400 settlement was in the third. The signature line was at the bottom, with a space beside it for the date and Sir Edmund's witnessing solicitor. "I should like more time," Patience said. "You have had sufficient time," Lady Vane said. "The 14th is in 2 days and everything is arranged." "I have not agreed to sign." Lady Vane looked at her with the particular weariness of a woman who has been waiting for this moment and has prepared for it. "Your agreement is implicit in your cooperation with this household, Patience. You have not raised a single serious objection. I am raising one now. A serious objection requires grounds." "That I do not wish to marry Sir Edmund Crail," Patience said, "is grounds sufficient in law." Lady Vane stood. The movement was controlled, the movement of a woman who has decided to change the register of the conversation. "You are 23 years old with no portion in a county where your opportunities contract each season. I have secured a man who will keep you in comfort. You will not refuse this out of sentiment." Patience met her mother's eyes. "I will not sign this document," she said. "Not on the 14th, and not after it." Lady Vane left the morning room without another word, and the door was not slammed, because Lady Vane was not a woman who slammed doors. The silence she left behind was considerably louder. Patience sat at the morning room table for some minutes after, with the unsigned document in front of her, and felt the specific coldness of a decision that no one was going to help her bear. Then she folded her hands, stood, and went to prepare the household for the 14th. The morning of the 14th, Sir Edmund arrived at 11 with his solicitor and Lady Vane's cousin from London, and Mrs. Aldridge, who had stayed on, and 2 of Lady Vane's particular acquaintances from the village, so that the drawing-room at Ashford Hall held 12 people before noon, and had the atmosphere of a room that has been arranged to make refusal difficult. Patrick Fletcher was there because Mrs. Dallow had included him in the morning's gathering, apparently at the estate trustee's instruction, to present the preliminary findings of his survey to the assembled household before his work was formally concluded. This was presented to the room as a piece of estate business. Patience, who had not known he would be there, did not betray her surprise. She stood near the window and was composed. Sir Edmund produced the betrothal document. Lady Vane indicated the writing table, where a quill had been left in its stand. The 12 people in the room arranged themselves as an audience. Patience walked to the table. She looked at the document, at the 4 paragraphs and the signature line and the £400 figure in the 3rd paragraph. She looked at Sir Edmund's solicitor, who was holding a blotter. She looked at Sir Edmund, who was looking back at her with the composed expectation of a man who has been assured that this detail is already settled. She set the quill down. "I will not sign," she said. The room did not become noisy. It became very still in the way rooms do when a social script has departed from its expected course, and no one has yet found the new one. Sir Edmund cleared his throat. "Miss Vane, the terms have been agreed. Your mother has given her consent." "My mother's consent is her own business," Patience said. "The signature line belongs to me." "You are making a considerable error," he said, and his voice had dropped to the specific register men use when they wish to sound reasonable and mean something else entirely. A girl of your circumstances does not refuse a settled arrangement without understanding what she is refusing toward. I understand it clearly, she said. Miss Vane. This was Lady Vane from her chair near the fire. You will not embarrass this household. Patience opened her mouth to reply and did not, because from near the far wall came a small sound. The footman posted at the side door had straightened. He was looking at Patrick Fletcher with the expression of a man who has placed a face and cannot now unplace it. My lord, the footman said, in the reflexive, unhesitating voice of complete certainty. Shall I fetch the carriage? Every head in the room turned. Patrick Fletcher did not move immediately. He stood where he had been standing near the map he had placed on the side table for the survey presentation, and the footman's words settled over the drawing room the way snow settles, covering everything with a new and silent layer that changed the appearance of every surface. Patience looked at him. He met her eyes across the room. His expression was not apologetic and not triumphant. It was the expression she had come to know across an estate library table and in a garden full of copper light. The expression of a man who was waiting to know whether she had enough, whether she could bear one more truth on top of all the others. She could. Your Grace, said Mrs. Dallow from near the door, and her voice was steady in the way that Mrs. Dallow's voice was always steady. Or my lord, rather, the Earl of Hartwell, if the room wishes to be precise. The room wished to be nothing. The room was entirely silent. Sir Edmund turned to Lady Vane with an expression that sought some instruction about how to proceed in a situation that his social vocabulary had not equipped him for. Lady Vane had no instruction to offer. She was looking at Patrick, at the Earl of Hartwell, with the particular stillness of a woman who has been calculating a sum for years and has just discovered that the figure she was working with was wrong from the beginning. He spoke then, directly, quietly, to Patience. I have been on these grounds for a month, he said, surveying, as reported. I have also been determining whether the estate and its neighbouring households merit the investment of my attention going forward. He paused. They do. He reached into the inside breast pocket of his coat and withdrew a letter. It bore a red wax seal that the solicitor across the room identified in an instant by the precise stillness of his own body as the Hartwell crest. I have a proposal of my own to put before this room, he continued, one that does not require Miss Vane's signature under the terms laid out in that document. He looked at Sir Edmund's solicitor with the pleasant, exact attention of a man accustomed to being the person in the room whose opinion settles questions. You may tell your client that the settlement terms are superseded by my own, which are considerably more advantageous to Miss Vane, and which I intend to make public before this gathering disperses. Sir Edmund Crail stood for a moment with his hat in his hands in precisely the posture he had occupied at the beginning of the scene, and then he said, to no one in particular, that he had pressing business elsewhere, and the solicitor folded the betrothal document, and the two of them were out of the drawing-room in under 3 minutes, which was approximately 2 minutes and 50 seconds faster than they had entered it. Lady Vane did not leave. She sat in her chair by the fire, and the fire cast its ordinary light on her face, and she looked at her daughter, and then at the Earl of Hartwell, with the expression of a woman in the process of understanding that she had been managing a situation she did not fully comprehend. She was not a foolish woman, and she was not cruel in the conscious way, and the understanding arrived on her face like weather, slow, and then all at once. My lord, she said finally, because she was a woman who knew her forms of address. I was not aware. No, he said. That was rather the point. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Mrs. Aldridge and the two village acquaintances found reasons to occupy themselves with their teacups and the curtains and one another, the universal tactic of drawing-room witnesses who wish to suggest they have seen nothing that will require them to report it precisely. Patience stood near the window with the unsigned document on the table behind her and the copper November light coming through the glass and settling across the room. She was looking at Patrick, at the man who had been on these grounds for a month, who had stood in the beeches with his surveyor's rod, and in the walled garden with his notebook closed, and in the library with the 1801 survey spread between them. He crossed the room to her, 12 feet of polished Ashford floorboard, and he covered it with the unhurried step of a man who has covered a great deal of ground to arrive at a very specific place. "I should have told you earlier," he said quietly, so that the room heard, but just barely. "I did not, because I needed to know who you were without knowing who I was." "And?" she said. "You already know what I found," he said. She thought about the shawl offered without ceremony in the October rain. She thought about the directions given at the elder tree. She thought about 2 hours of library silence that asked nothing of her. She thought about a month of windows and paths and maps and a garden in copper light and the steady accumulation of being known. "Mrs. Dallow told me you watched the windows," she said. "I did," he said. "For 4 weeks before you opened the door." "The door was never locked," she said. "I know," he said. "I was waiting until I had earned the right to come through it." She looked at him in the plain November light, in front of 12 people, and a fire, and the drawing room of Ashford Hall, and she said, "Then come through it." He took her hand, there in front of the room, in the old-fashioned deliberate way that meant something in 1831, and was understood by everyone present to mean exactly what it was. Not a performance, not a social tactic. A man taking the hand of a woman he had watched for a month, and chosen on the evidence of everything she had not known, she was demonstrating. Lady Vane looked at her daughter's hand in the Earl's hand and said nothing. The understanding had finished arriving and was settled now, and whatever she felt about the distance between the situation she had arranged and the situation she was in, she had the sense not to speak any of it aloud. Mrs. Dallow had tears in her eyes, though she would have denied it. Later that afternoon, when the guests had sorted themselves into departure or cautious congratulation, and the drawing-room had returned to something approaching its ordinary temperature, Patience walked through the side door of Ashford Hall and down the stone passage to the library. The fire was still lit, banked low. The 1801 survey was still on the table, not yet returned to its case. The map cases along the north wall stood in their familiar order, organised by decade, the earliest from 1743, the latest from 1819. The rooms smelled of old paper and low coal, and the specific quality of November light, which arrived through the long windows in long, specific angles, and lay across the floor in strips. She stood at the threshold for a moment, not because she was uncertain, because crossing a threshold that has been denied you for a long time deserves a moment of its own, a pause that acknowledges what the crossing costs and what the crossing returns. Then she stepped in and went to the long table and spread her hands flat on the old map and felt the grain of it under her palms, and the room was warm and quiet and entirely her own.